Ah, cold weather survival. It's always been a battle, hasn't it? A battle between the human body and the unstoppable physics of heat loss. Long before we had synthetic sleeping bags, reflective foils, and those ultralight insulation panels, soldiers, explorers, and frontier workers, they had to rely on one single dependable tool: wool. You see, it wasn't just valued for its warmth. No, it was prized because, when used correctly, it created its own insulation layer, something many modern folks tend to forget. The old-timers, they had a saying that wool wasn't just a fabric, it was a system. They knew how to fold it, trap air in it, and layer it in such a way that turned a simple blanket into a heat machine. This trick it resurfaced time and again in harsh campaigns, like the winter battles of World War II. Troops learned fast that a poorly used blanket meant misery, but a properly set wool layer, well, that could mean survival. Now, how did soldiers discover that the air inside the blanket mattered more than the blanket itself? What made wool so invaluable was not the fibres themselves, but the air trapped between them. Soldiers quickly realized that crushing a wool blanket by lying directly on it, well, it just wasted its potential, you see. Compressed wool loses loft, which is that lovely thickness that traps warm air. To counter this, seasoned troops had a rather clever trick. They folded the blanket in a very specific way. Instead of lying on top of it, they folded a section into a narrow roll and placed it beneath their body as a spacer. Quite ingenious, really. This technique, lifted them slightly from the frozen ground, while keeping the main surface of the blanket fluffed above them. The result was a layer of warm air forming inside the blanket rather than being squeezed out of it. Fascinating how such a simple adjustment can make such a difference. Nowadays, modern campers still use this idea by placing gear or clothing beneath their torso while covering themselves with fully lofted wool. And, it works in both tents and improvised shelters. Quite remarkable how these old techniques continue to serve us well, even today. The ingenious blanket cocoon method. It was like creating a personal heat chamber around the sleeper. You see, one of the most effective ways World War II troops utilized wool was by forming a cocoon with overlapping layers. These layers came together to create a sealed cavity around their core. It was quite the clever approach, really. Now, let's talk about the wrapping technique. They would lay the blanket so that one corner stretched long behind them and another folded toward their feet. Once they lay down, they wrapped the long top corner over the shoulder, tucking it under the opposite side. But mind you, they kept some space above the chest. It's all in the details, isn't it? That space, it was crucial. It allowed the blanket to puff outward, trapping a bubble of warm air. They would repeat the same action for the lower half. It's fascinating how such a simple technique could make all the difference. This technique produced a self-insulating chamber that required no additional equipment. A modern application is simple. Spread a wool blanket diagonally, lie across the centre, pull the top corner over the torso, and tuck it under without tightening it across your chest. When done properly, you create a dome that warms itself within minutes. How keeping the blanket slightly elevated allowed heat to build instead of escape. Another critical insight was that wool worked best when it was allowed to breathe. Soldiers who pinned the blanket tightly around their body found themselves sweating first and freezing later. Moisture trapped inside wool cools rapidly. The successful method involved creating vent points where steam could escape but heat remained. Soldiers often did this by propping a small stick, canteen, or even rolled socks under part of the blanket near their chest or thigh. Now, here's a nifty trick. This tiny elevation lifted the wool just enough to let moist air drift out, while preventing those pesky cold drafts from entering. You can replicate this by leaving a small lofted gap around the chest area when wrapping up. It's quite clever, really. The difference is, well, quite dramatic indeed. The blanket stays dry, stays warm, and continues insulating throughout the night. It's fascinating how such a simple adjustment can have such a significant impact. And here's another interesting point. Soldiers would layer wool with their clothing to create a multi-stage insulation system. It's all about keeping warm and maximizing efficiency, you see. Cold weather veterans knew that the clothing worn beneath the blanket defined how well the blanket worked. Wool, you see, functioned best when paired with dry underlayers and breathable fabrics. Soldiers often slept in their base layers or stripped off damp clothes to avoid chilling. The dry layer kept their skin warm, and the wool above handled the larger insulation duty. This is still one of the most dependable cold sleep systems today. A practical example is, well, wearing a dry thermal top, wool socks, and breathable trousers before bedding down. Then you wrap yourself in a wool blanket cocoon. Even in temperatures near freezing, this combination maintains body heat because, you see, each layer performs a separate role. One keeps heat close to the body, and the other prevents it from escaping. Now, let's talk about how the ground barrier worked with the blanket to, maximize heat retention. A wool blanket alone is powerful, but, soldiers found that it was unbeatable when paired with a proper barrier beneath them. During the war, they used pine boughs, brush sandbags, or even clothing bundles. The moment the body was kept off the frozen ground, the wool could perform at its best. You can do this by laying anything dry and non-conductive under you, a foam pad if available, or, in true emergency conditions, a pile of leaves, spare clothing, even a backpack under your hips. Once the ground no longer steals your heat, the wool blanket finally does what it was designed to do: create an insulation layer fueled by your own body temperature. How wool proved itself in both wet and freezing conditions. Wool's real strength came from its ability to insulate while damp. Soldiers caught in sleet, snow, or freezing rain could still rely on their blankets. Even when wet, wool continued to trap heat because the fibres resist water saturation and maintain air pockets inside. If you ever find yourself bedding down after unexpected rain, wool remains the most forgiving material you can wrap yourself in. A practical application is drying the blanket near a fire until it reaches a warm, damp state rather than fully dry. Even at this stage, its insulating ability remains strong enough to sustain warmth through the night. Now, when you apply this method today, you can, turn a simple wool blanket into a genuine survival tool. When you combine lifted loft, ground insulation, breathable wrapping and controlled layering, one blanket really does become a full survival system. This method is still used by winter hikers, military survival schools and long-distance trekkers because, honestly, it doesn't rely on modern gear or batteries. It relies on physics and technique, the very same principles soldiers learned through bitter cold and long nights. If you want more field-tested historical survival knowledge like this, just subscribe to Thermal Vault and share this guide with others who appreciate the old methods that quite often still outperform modern shortcuts.